Hey guys, how are you? It's Kevin Schmidt, physical therapist, bike fitter out here in Portland, Oregon with Pedal PT. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to measure your own saddle height and especially to be able to take that information and compare that to different bikes. Let's say you've got a mountain bike with 175 millimeter cranks. How do you compare that to a bike that you have that has maybe 170 millimeter cranks? That's what we're going to talk about today. So grab a measuring tape and get ready. Let's do it. All right, so if you're going to compare different bikes and the saddle heights that have different crank lengths, or maybe you're not aware of what your crank lengths are, the first thing is to determine what the crank length is, because that does influence the saddle height. So the first thing we're going to do is teach you a little bit on how to find the crank length. Most of the time you're going to come to your bike, every crank usually has it printed on the inside part of the crank. So if we were to look on the inside part of this Shimano crank, we can look and say this is a 170 millimeter crank, okay? On this other bike, on the mountain bike, we're going to show you also how to check that one. That one ends up being 175 millimeters. So you just want to just assess if the bike is the same crank length that you're going to be comparing or comparing saddle height to. Doesn't really matter, but if you do have a difference in crank length, we're going to need to do a little bit of math to adjust that. All right, now that we've determined the crank length, what we need to do is figure out how to measure saddle height. And what we're going to be measuring is you typically will measure on the non-drive side, so the side without the chain and the derailleur. We're going to come to the non-drive side to the bottom bracket, and we're going to measure from the center of the bottom bracket. We're going to follow that measuring tape all the way up as a straight line, all the way up to the measure to the top of the saddle, the fabric itself. That will give us a good accurate measurement that we can transfer over to the other bike. Perfect, so we'll take our measuring tape. Usually you use that in centimeters. It's usually a little bit easier. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna get that centered right on the bottom there. We're then gonna get very close. We're gonna follow right along the path of that seat tube. And then you're gonna come right up to the top of that saddle. You're gonna try to get your head and eyes roughly at that saddle level so you can take that measurement. And on this bike, it ends up being 74.5 centimeters. Perfect, so what we're gonna do, we've got a measurement then of a saddle height with 170 millimeter cranks measuring at 74.5 centimeters. We're now gonna transfer that to a bike that we're not sure what the saddle height is, but it does have a difference in crank length. So let's take a look at that. All right, great. And even though we're comparing, let's say a road bike geometry to a mountain bike, roughly you want your saddle height roughly the same. The thing we have to look at now is what is the crank length on this 1997 S-Works. So when we get down here close, we can kind of start to see on this one, this is actually a 175 millimeter crank. So it's actually 5 millimeters longer than the other crank that we just assessed where our saddle height was 74.5. So what we need to do is we need to do a little bit of math. So at the bottom of this pedal stroke, we're actually going to be another 5 millimeters further down. So what we actually have to do is take that number, 74.5, subtract 5 millimeters. In this case, it makes it very easy. So now what we're going to do is we're going to measure from here to here, and we need to measure it to 74 centimeters. So again, same concept again. We're going to come to the non-drive side, center of bottom bracket, up to the fabric up here at the top of the saddle. And so as we do that, we'll bring you right up to here and here. And right now, this is measuring at about 69 centimeters. So we're going to need to raise that saddle by roughly 5 centimeters to make it the equivalent of what our bike was on the other side. We're just going to unscrew this, and we're going to end up starting to raise this saddle up until we get to about 74 centimeters is what we're looking for. So we'll raise it a little bit, then we'll remeasure. Great. So now we've measured it at 74 centimeters, which is the equivalent of a bike with 170 cranks at 74.5. So roughly our saddle height is the same. Now there are other variables to consider, such as fore and aft, tilt, nose up, nose down. But in the general scheme of things, this will at least get you pretty darn close to what your current saddle height is if you're used to another bike and now wanting to transfer it onto a different bike, irregardless of the bike, whether that's a road bike or a mountain bike.